Our Bible text is 1 Peter 3 verses 18 to 19. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. So this is about Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison. But the larger context it comes from, it actually speaks to the Christians and their suffering in the context that they are. Remember, they were living along the north or just south of the Black Sea, along Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and Asia, those parts. And Peter addresses them in the context of suffering. And this letter makes many reference to their suffering. And the root cause of their suffering is that they abandoned their previous way of life, their pagan way of life. Already in chapter 1, verses 18, Peter writes there, knowing that you were, or he speaks there of them being redeemed from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers. And so they refused now to live like their fellow countrymen. Although they were resident aliens or they were foreigners there, they were not locals. Of course, this also refers to their metaphorical status as aliens here on earth because their true citizenship is in heaven. But they abandoned their previous pagan lifestyle, their sinful lifestyle, and now they live an ethical life orientated towards Christ, the gospel. So now they are targeted and abused by those living around them because they abandoned their previous way of life. So we can also think in many contexts today where Christianity is being reviled or looked down upon by surrounding societies. So Peter often speaks to their suffering. And there are two major portions to 1 Peter. The first is that focuses on the relationships within the community. And that is 1 Peter 1 verses 22 to chapter 2 verses 10. And then where our current Bible word comes from, that's 1 Peter 2 verses 11 to 4 verses 11. It's how to live in a hostile world. It's this hostile world from which they experience abuse, etc. And if we look now more closely around the context of our immediate Bible word, there are three main areas. Firstly, is from chapter 3, verses 13 to 17. That's where they are admonished, or Peter speaks there about suffering for the sake of good. And then from verses 18 to 22, he speaks about Christ also suffered for good. And then from chapter 4, verses 1 to 6, it's also suffer like Christ suffered in order to bring an end to sin. So we can see there's lots of references to suffering here in this letter. But Peter also admonishes, suffer for the right reason. Don't suffer for the wrong reason. I mean, if you suffer because you do evil, then there's no good to that. But if you suffer for doing good, that's the right thing to do. For example, if we go to chapter 2, verses 19 to 20, he says, for this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. He says something similar in chapter 4 from verses 14 to 16. Suffer for the right thing. Because if you suffer for doing evil, well, that's meaningless. But if you suffer for the good, for your profession of Christ, etc., well, that's a good thing. That's a good reason to suffer. And he also writes, if we suffer, we are partakers of the sufferings of Christ. If we go to chapter 4, verses 12 to 13, Peter writes there, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. So, suffer for the right reasons, that is your profession of Christ, and also your sufferings, it participates in the suffering of Christ as well. So now if we go to chapter 3, verses 13 to 17, he tells them there, well, suffer for the sake of good, he writes there. And in verse 14, he writes there, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And in verse 17, for it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. So it's about suffering for the sake of good. And now, most immediate context, that's from verses 18 to 20, he explains that Christ also suffered for a good purpose. The suffering of Christ was not meaningless. If we go to verse 18, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. So that was the purpose of Christ's suffering. He was a just person. He suffered for us as sinners. He died for our sins in order to bring us to God. So Jesus' suffering also had purpose. It was meaningful suffering. And now if we come to our Bible word, let's read it again. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. So now Peter explains what happened with Jesus after he suffered and died. He explains he went to the spirits in prison. He proclaimed the gospel to them, because the Greek word here is kerusso. It means to proclaim. And it's used in the New Testament in reference to the proclamation of the gospel. So Jesus went and he preached, or he proclaimed the good news, to the gospel, to the spirits in prison. And it refers to those who were alive at the time of Noah while the ark was being built. Of course, we also understand it that Christ preached to all the dead at this time. And this is also, if we go to chapter 4, verses 6, in a similar verse, Peter also writes there, for this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. So Jesus preached, he proclaimed the gospel to the spirits in prison and those who were alive at the time of Noah. So this is what happened after his suffering. And he speaks also now, he digresses a bit because he refers to the flood, the waters of the flood. And this water of the flood, there's an antitype to it. In other words, a counter image to that. Where the flood brought destruction, but in a narrow sense also salvation, or it was the means by Noah and his family was saved. Baptism is the means by which God essentially saves. So that's the antitype to this water of the flood, is baptism. It is the means by which we are saved. And it's also because a result of Christ's resurrection. So this is what happened after Christ's suffering. He went and he preached to the spirits in prison. And he digresses by saying, speaking of the flood, and there's an antitype to this water of the flood. It's baptism that saves us. It's by the resurrection of Christ also that we are saved. And in verse 22, because of the resurrection of Christ, he's gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God. Angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. So, after his suffering, Jesus went to preach to the spirits in prison. He was raised from the dead. He went to heaven, seated at the right hand of God, and all evil powers were made subject to him. So that's what happened after his suffering. But also here, of course, the main idea is the suffering of Jesus was meaningful. Meaningful events happened. He died for our sins. He preached the gospel to the spirits in prison. He was raised after that. He was exalted and is now Lord. He has rule over everything. And now the next portion, chapter 4, verses 1 to 6, is also suffer like Christ suffered to bring an end to sin. Especially if we read there, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. Again, the suffering is is caused by people putting pressure on them to conform to their previous way of life. And Peter admonished them, suffer. Because if you suffer, it means you're stopping to sin. You're not giving in to the norms and values of your surrounding culture. Because he also writes there in verse 4, in regards to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. So Peter said, that's good. Because if you suffer in that way, it means you're not giving in to the values and norms of society. You're continuing to live an ethical life, a life based on the teaching of Jesus. So 1 Peter, it's full of teaching about suffering, but don't suffer meaninglessly, where you bring things on yourself where you've done evil. It's about suffering meaningfully. It's about suffering for the sake of the gospel, despite the pressure and abuse from society around you. Because Christ also suffered, and his suffering was also meaningful. And by our suffering, by not giving in to the norms of society, we bring sin to an end.